The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Kestrel when Staff Sergeant Marisol Wraith Vega first spotted the unidentified aircraft on the horizon. She'd been manning the observation post since 400 hours, her weathered hands gripping the M4 carbine that had become an extension of herself over 3 tours in Afghanistan. The desert air still held the night's chill, but something else made her skin crawl, a vibration in the ground that didn't belong to their usual supply drops or medevac runs. "Control, this is Overwatch 7, she radioed, her voice steady despite the growing unease. "I've got an unknown aircraft inbound from the northeast, bearing 045. Request immediate identification." The static crackled for longer than usual before Sergeant Mills responded from the command post. "Overwatch 7, we show no scheduled flights in your sector. Can you provide visual confirmation?" Marisol raised her binoculars, the lenses catching the early light. What she saw made her blood run cold. The aircraft was moving too fast, too low, and in a pattern that screamed attack-run. But as it banked toward their position, something on the fuselage caught her attention, a marking that shouldn't exist, painted in colors that belonged to a different war entirely. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, then keyed her radio again. "Control, you need to see this. That aircraft. It's got WAR markings, but they're wrong. They're from the Pacific Theater, World War II vintage." The response came back confused, almost irritated. "Overwatch 7, please clarify. Are you saying it's a restored Warbird?" But Marisol knew better. She'd grown up listening to her grandfather's stories, studying every detail of his service with the 332nd Fighter Group. The red-tailed P-51 Mustang approaching their position bore the exact nose art he described in his letters home, a ghostly figure with flowing hair and piercing eyes, riding a silver arrow through storm clouds. Her grandfather had called it La Fantasma, the ghost, and it had been his squadron's pride until the day he was shot down over Italy in 1944. The impossible truth hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just any restored aircraft. This was tail number 4415374, her grandfather's plane, the one that had been lost with him over the Mediterranean Sea more than 80 years ago. But that was impossible. The plane had never been recovered, and her grandfather's body had never been found. As the Mustang's engine note grew louder, Marisol's rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers. The desert fell silent except for the approaching roar of Merlin engines that should have been nothing but rust and coral on the ocean floor. Marisol's hands shook as she reached for her radio, trying to make sense of what couldn't be real. The P-51 Mustang was now close enough that she could see the pilot's silhouette in the cockpit, and her heart nearly stopped. The figure wore a leather flight jacket and old-style aviation goggles, exactly as her grandfather had described himself in his final letter. "Control, we have a situation," she managed, her voice barely controlled. "That aircraft. It's impossible, but I'm looking at my grandfather's plane, the one that went down in '44. Static filled the comm channel before Mills came back, his tone sharp with concern. "Overwatch 7, you need to maintain your position and stay focused. Unknown aircraft can be disorienting, but—" "You don't understand," Marisol interrupted, watching the Mustang circle their perimeter like a hunting falcon. "My grandfather flew with the Tuskegee Airmen. His plane was shot down over Italy and never recovered. But I'm looking at it right now, and there's someone in that cockpit." The P-51 completed its circle and began a slow approach toward the base's makeshift runway. As it passed overhead, Marisol caught a glimpse of the pilot's face through the canopy glass. Her knees buckled. The man in the cockpit had the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes she'd seen in countless photographs. But Carlos Vega had been dead for decades. The Mustang touched down with impossible grace, its tires barely kissing the packed earth before settling into a perfect landing roll. The engine note changed from a roar to a purr, then slowly wound down to silence. In that quiet moment, Marisol felt the weight of 3 generations pressing down on her shoulders. She joined the army to honor her grandfather's legacy, but she'd never expected that legacy to taxi up to her front door. The canopy slid back with a metallic scrape, and the pilot began to climb out. He moved with the confident ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, his leather jacket creaking softly in the morning air. "Mija," he called out, his voice carrying across the tarmac with startling clarity. "We need to talk." Marisol's world tilted off its axis. Only one person had ever called her that in exactly that tone, and he'd been buried, or lost, before she was even born. Yet here he stood, looking exactly as he had in the faded photographs her grandmother had treasured. Other soldiers were emerging from their positions now, weapons raised but uncertain. The impossible had just landed in their midst, and nobody knew how to process it. Staff Sergeant Mills came jogging across the compound, his radio crackling with confused chatter from higher command. "Sergeant Vega, step back from that aircraft. We don't know what we're dealing with here." But Marisol couldn't move. The pilot was walking toward her now, and she could see the worn leather of his jacket, the silver wings pinned to his chest, the confident smile that had charmed her grandmother all those years ago. This was either the most elaborate hoax in military history, or something had gone very wrong with the natural order of things. "Abuelo," she whispered, the word barely audible over the settling sounds of the cooling aircraft. The pilot stopped just 10 feet away, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "You have your grandmother's eyes," he said softly, "but you carry yourself like a soldier. Good. We're going to need that." Behind him, the P-51 Mustang sat gleaming in the morning sun, its red tail catching the light like fresh blood. The nose art seemed to shift and move in Marisol's peripheral vision, the ghostly figure appearing to beckon her forward. She blinked hard, but the sensation remained. "Sir," Mills called out, his voice tight with authority and confusion, "I need you to identify yourself and explain how you got past our air defenses." The pilot turned toward Mills, and Marisol saw something flicker across his features, amusement mixed with something darker. "Sergeant, you wouldn't believe me if I told you, but I'm here for my granddaughter. She's the only one who can complete the mission." "What mission?" Marisol found her voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Her grandfather, if this was really him, smiled grimly. "The one I started in 1944, the one that got me killed, the one that's been waiting for a Vega to finish ever since." The morning air seemed to thicken around them, pregnant with possibilities that defied every rational explanation. Marisol felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a flight jacket. More soldiers had gathered now, forming a loose perimeter around the impossible scene. Their weapons were raised but uncertain, trained on a target that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. The base commander's voice crackled over the radio, demanding updates and explanations that nobody could provide. "Sergeant Vega," Mills said, his tone carefully controlled, "I need you to step away from this individual. We don't know what kind of psychological operation we're dealing with here." But Marisol couldn't move. The man before her radiated a familiar warmth, a presence that felt like coming home after a long deployment. His eyes held depths of experience that spoke of aerial combat and brotherhood forged in the crucible of war. When he smiled, she saw her own reflection in his features, the same stubborn jaw, the same determined set to the shoulders. "Tell me about the mission," she said, ignoring Mills' increasingly urgent commands. Her grandfather glanced at the P-51, then back at her. "In 1944, I was escorting a special payload over the Mediterranean. Not bombs, not supplies, something else. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. When the Messerschmitts jumped us, I thought I was just another casualty of war. But I was wrong." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth by decades of handling. "This is what I was carrying. Orders that came from the highest levels, sealed with authority that went beyond military channels. I never got to deliver it, but I never forgot what it said. The portfolio seemed to pulse with its own energy, and Marisol felt drawn to it despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain distance. What did it say? That's classified, Mija. But what I can tell you is that some missions transcend time, some duties follow bloodlines, and some promises can only be kept by family. He held out the portfolio, and Marisol felt her hand moving toward it without conscious thought. The moment her fingers made contact with the leather, the world exploded into sensation. Visions flashed through her mind, aerial battles over foreign skis, desperate radio calls for help, the moment when flak burst around her grandfather's plane and sent him spiraling toward the sea. But there was more. She saw meetings in shadowed rooms, documents that bore seals she didn't recognize, and orders that spoke of preparations for conflicts that hadn't yet begun. The mission her grandfather had died trying to complete wasn't just about World War II. It was about a war that was still coming. The payload, she gasped, the visions clearing enough for her to speak. It's still out there. Now you understand, her grandfather said, his voice filled with pride and sorrow. I've been waiting 80 years for someone with the skills to finish what I started. Someone who could fly, fight, and think like a Vega. Mills was shouting now, calling for backup and demanding explanations. But his voice seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the weight of revelation. Marisol looked at the P-51 Mustang, its silver fuselage gleaming like a promise, and felt her destiny crystallizing around her. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Her grandfather's smile was fierce with approval. "First, you need to remember how to fly." The implications hit her like a physical blow. She'd been a pilot before her current assignment, flying helicopters for medical evacuation missions until a crash had grounded her permanently. The doctors had said her depth perception was too damaged for safe flight operations, but looking at the P-51, she felt something stirring in her chest that had been dormant for months. "I can't fly anymore," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "Medical discharge. They said I'd never be cleared for flight duty again." "They said that about conventional aircraft," her grandfather replied. "But this isn't conventional. This is La Fantasma, and she doesn't fly by the same rules as everything else." He turned toward the Mustang, and Marisol saw the nose art more clearly now. The ghostly figure wasn't just painted on the fuselage. It was moving, shifting, becoming more solid with each passing moment. The flowing hair seemed to billow in a wind that didn't exist, and the piercing eyes were focused directly on her. "She's been waiting for you," her grandfather said softly, "just like I have." The base was in chaos now. Vehicles were approaching from multiple directions, their engines roaring with urgency. Radio chatter filled the air with demands for explanations and orders for containment. But in the center of it all, Marisol felt a strange calm settling over her. She looked at her grandfather, then at the impossible aircraft, then at the portfolio still clutched in her hands. The weight of generations pressed down on her, but for the first time in months, she felt truly awake. "If I do this," she said, "there's no going back, is there?" "There never was," her grandfather replied. "From the moment you put on the uniform, you were walking toward this moment. The question is whether you're ready to embrace it." Marisol took a deep breath, tasting the desert air and the faint scent of aviation fuel. Around her, the modern world continued its frantic attempts to make sense of the impossible. But she was no longer part of that world. She was part of something older, something that stretched back through time and forward into possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. "I'm ready," she said. The moment the words left her lips, the P-51's engine coughed to life with a roar that shook the ground. The ghostly figure in the nose art turned toward her and smiled, extending one ethereal hand in welcome. Behind her, Mills was shouting orders, but his voice seemed to fade into background noise. Marisol Vega had found her true mission at last. The Mustang's engine settled into a steady rumble, and her grandfather gestured toward the cockpit with obvious pride. She's been waiting 80 years for a worthy pilot. Don't keep her waiting any longer. But as Marisol approached the aircraft, Mills finally caught up with them, his service pistol drawn and trained on her grandfather. That's enough. Nobody moves another step until we sort this out. The confrontation that followed would change everything. Mills represented the rational world, the world of regulations and procedures and things that made sense. Her grandfather represented something else entirely, duty that transcended death, missions that spanned generations, and the kind of truth that couldn't be explained in after-action reports. "Sergeant Mills," Marisol said, her voice carrying new authority, "you need to lower your weapon." "Like hell I do. This whole situation is FUBAR, and I'm not letting anyone else get hurt because of it." Her grandfather chuckled, a sound that held decades of combat experience. "Son, you're holding a pistol on a dead man. You might want to reconsider your tactics." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. A staff sergeant was pointing a sidearm at a pilot who'd been killed in action before the sergeant was born, while said pilot's granddaughter prepared to climb into an aircraft that had been lost at sea for 8 decades. It was the kind of scenario that would have been rejected as too implausible for fiction. But the P-51 Mustang was real enough. Its engine thrummed with mechanical precision, and the heat shimmer from its exhaust was visible in the morning air. Whatever force had brought it here, whatever impossible circumstances had reunited 3 generations of Vegas, the aircraft itself was undeniably present. "Mills," Marisol said, stepping between her grandfather and the sergeant's weapon, "I know this is hard to process, but I need you to trust me." "Trust you to what? Climb into a ghost plane with a dead pilot?" Marisol, listen to yourself. The use of her first name instead of her rank told her everything she needed to know about Mill's state of mind. He was scared, confused, and reaching for any anchor of normalcy he could find. She couldn't blame him. 3 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether the mess hall would serve decent coffee. "The mission," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "There's a mission that needs to be completed." "What mission? According to who?" "Him." Mills gestured with his pistol toward her grandfather. "For all we know, this is some kind of elaborate psychological operation. Maybe the enemy has new technology, holographic projections, something we don't understand yet." Her grandfather's expression grew serious. "Sergeant, I respect your dedication to your duty, but you're thinking too small. This isn't about current conflicts or enemy technology. This is about something that was set in motion before your grandparents were born." "Then explain it. Give me something I can put in a report, something that makes sense." The plea in Mill's voice was heartbreaking. He was a good soldier, dedicated to his duties and his people, but he was also trapped in a worldview that couldn't accommodate the impossible. Marisol felt a wave of sympathy for him, mixed with growing certainty about her own path. "Some things can't be explained," she said gently. "They can only be experienced." As if responding to her words, the P-51's engine note changed, becoming more insistent. The ghostly figure in the nose art was moving more actively now, gesturing toward the cockpit with obvious urgency. Time was running out for explanations and debates. "Mija," her grandfather said, his voice carrying a weight of authority that made Mill's pistol seem irrelevant, "we need to go. The window won't stay open much longer." The decision crystallized in Marisol's mind with startling clarity. She could stay here, try to explain the inexplicable, submit to interrogation and psychological evaluation, and all the bureaucratic machinery that would grind this extraordinary moment into dust. Or she could trust in something larger than herself, something that connected her to a legacy of service and sacrifice that spanned generations. She chose legacy. "Mills," she said, turning to face him fully, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell them that Staff Sergeant Marisol Vega died in the line of duty, that she gave her life completing a classified mission that helped keep America safe." Marisol, no, don't do this. But she was already moving toward the P-51, her grandfather falling into step beside her. The aircraft seemed to grow larger as they approached, its silver fuselage gleaming with an inner light that had nothing to do with the morning sun. The ghostly figure in the nose art was smiling now, welcoming her home. "Remember," her grandfather said as they reached the wing, "La Fantasma doesn't fly like other aircraft. She responds to intent as much as control inputs. Trust your instincts, and she'll take you where you need to go." Marisol placed her hand on the wing, feeling the metal warm beneath her palm. The P-51 was solid, real, undeniably present. Whatever forces had brought it here, whatever impossible circumstances had made this moment possible, the aircraft itself was no illusion. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To finish what I started," her grandfather replied. "To deliver a payload that's been waiting 80 years for the right pilot." Behind them, Mills was shouting into his radio, calling for backup and medical personnel, and anyone who might be able to make sense of the situation. But his voice seemed to come from another world, a world of regulations and procedures and things that could be explained in official reports. Marisol was no longer part of that world. She was part of something older, something that connected her to every pilot who'd ever taken to the skis in defense of freedom. As she climbed into the cockpit of La Fantasma, she felt the weight of history settling around her like a well-worn flight jacket. The controls were familiar yet strange, analog instruments that belonged to a different era of aviation. But her hands knew what to do, guided by instincts that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. The ghostly figure in the nose art was visible through the canopy now, no longer confined to the fuselage, but standing beside the aircraft like a guardian angel. "Ready?" her grandfather asked, his voice coming through the headset with crystal clarity. Marisol looked down at Mills, who was staring up at her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be all right, but she wasn't sure that was true. She was about to embark on a mission that defied every rational explanation, guided by a grandfather who'd been dead for 80 years and flying an aircraft that shouldn't exist. "Ready," she said and meant it. The P-51's engine roared to life with renewed vigor, and the ghostly figure took her place in the nose art once more. But now she was facing forward, her ethereal hands gripping the silver arrow that would carry them into the unknown. As the Mustang began to taxi toward the runway, Marisol felt the last ties to her old life falling away. She was no longer Staff Sergeant Marisol Vega, helicopter pilot grounded by medical discharge. She was something new, something that existed in the space between worlds, between past and future, between the living and the dead. The takeoff was smooth as silk, the P-51 lifting off the desert floor with eager grace. As they climbed into the morning sky, Marisol looked back once at forward operating base Kestrel, now shrinking rapidly below them. Mills was a tiny figure on the tarmac, still staring upward with his mouth agape. "Don't worry about him," her grandfather's voice came through the headset. "He'll figure out how to explain it. Good soldiers always do." The radio crackled with frantic calls from the base, demanding identification and flight plans and explanations that couldn't be given. But Marisol found herself reaching for the radio switch, compelled by something she couldn't name. "Control, this is Wraith 1, she said, using her old call sign for the last time. "I'm heading home." Then she switched off the radio and focused on the impossible sky ahead. The P-51 climbed steadily, its engine singing with mechanical perfection. The ghostly figure in the nose art was visible in her peripheral vision, no longer confined to the fuselage, but flying alongside them like a wingman made of starlight and memory. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked her grandfather. "The Mediterranean," he replied, To the place where I died, to the place where the mission began. The words sent a chill down Marisol's spine, but she found herself nodding. Of course that's where they were going. Some circles could only be closed where they'd been opened. Some missions could only be completed where they'd begun. As the P-51 Mustang climbed toward cruising altitude, leaving the desert of Afghanistan far behind, Marisol felt herself becoming part of something larger than any individual story. She was a link in a chain that stretched back through generations of warriors, a bridge between the living and the dead, a pilot tasked with completing a mission that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The sky ahead was clear and infinite, full of possibilities that defied rational explanation. And for the first time in months, Marisol Vega felt truly alive. The P-51 leveled off at 15,000 feet, its engine settling into the steady drone that had carried her grandfather across the skis of Europe decades ago. The cockpit felt familiar despite its anachronistic instruments, as if she'd been flying this particular aircraft her entire life. Through the canopy, the world spread out below them like a map of dreams and possibilities. "You're handling her well," her grandfather's voice came through the headset, warm with approval. "Better than I did on my first flight." Marisol smiled, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch with surprising sensitivity. "She's incredible. I've never flown anything like this." "That's because there's nothing like La Fantasma. She's not just an aircraft, she's a bridge between worlds, a vessel for missions that can't be completed by ordinary means." The explanation should have sounded insane, but sitting in the cockpit of an impossible aircraft, flying toward a destination that existed somewhere between memory and reality, Marisol found herself accepting it with surprising ease. The world had revealed new rules, and she was adapting to them with the flexibility that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. "Tell me about the original mission," she said, adjusting their heading slightly to account for a crosswind that shouldn't exist at this altitude. Her grandfather's voice grew serious. "In 1944, I was selected for a special assignment, not because I was the best pilot, though I was pretty good, but because I was expendable. A black pilot flying experimental missions over enemy territory. If something went wrong, the loss would be manageable." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable, and Marisol felt an echo of the discrimination he'd faced. Even in her own career, she'd encountered attitudes that suggested women, minorities, and anyone who didn't fit the traditional mold were somehow less capable, less valuable. "What was the payload?" she asked. "Information," he replied, "but not the kind you'd expect. Documents that detailed preparations for conflicts that hadn't yet begun, strategic plans for wars that were still decades in the future. Someone with incredible foresight had seen the shape of things to come and was trying to position the right people in the right places." The revelation sent a chill through Marisol's spine. "You're talking about intelligence that predicted future conflicts." "I'm talking about something bigger than intelligence. I'm talking about a network of people who could see the patterns, who understood that the war we were fighting was just the first movement in a much longer symphony. They were trying to prepare for what was coming next." The P-51 flew on through air that seemed to shimmer with possibility. Below them, the landscape had changed from desert to something that looked more like the Mediterranean coastline her grandfather had described. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, as if they were flying not just through space, but through time itself. "The payload was never delivered," her grandfather continued. "When the Messerschmitts jumped us over the Mediterranean, I thought I was just another casualty of war, but I was wrong. The mission didn't end with my death, it was just postponed." "For 80 years, Marisol said, understanding beginning to dawn. "For 80 years, until someone with the right combination of skills and bloodline could complete it. Someone who understood both the old ways of warfare and the new. Someone who could bridge the gap between what was and what needed to be." The ghostly figure in the nose art was more active now, pointing towards something on the horizon that Marisol couldn't yet see. But she could feel it, a presence that drew her forward with magnetic intensity. The destination of their impossible journey was approaching. "What happens when we get there?" she asked. "You'll deliver the payload," her grandfather replied, "to people who have been waiting 80 years for it, to a network that's been preparing for conflicts that are only now beginning to unfold." The implications were staggering. Marisol found herself thinking about current global tensions, the rise of new powers, the shifting balance of international relations. Was it possible that someone had foreseen these developments decades ago and had been working to prepare for them? "You're talking about a conspiracy," she said. "I'm talking about preparation," her grandfather corrected. "The difference is intent. Conspiracies are about gaining power for its own sake. This is about being ready to defend freedom when the next great test comes." The P-51 began a gentle descent, and Marisol could see their destination taking shape below them. It was an island that shouldn't exist, a piece of land that appeared on no modern charts but gleamed with the clarity of absolute reality. Ancient structures dotted its coastline, and she could see figures moving on what looked like an airfield carved from living rock. "Welcome to the place between worlds," her grandfather said softly. "Welcome to the headquarters of the longest war in history." As they approached the impossible island, Marisol felt the weight of destiny settling around her like armor. She was no longer just a pilot completing a mission. She was a warrior joining a campaign that spanned generations, a guardian taking her place in a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. The landing was perfect, the P-51 touching down on the stone runway with graceful precision. As the engine wound down, Marisol could see figures approaching the aircraft, people in uniforms that represented no single nation but seemed to embody the spirit of service itself. "Ready to meet your new commanding officers?" her grandfather asked. Marisol took a deep breath, feeling the portfolio of documents pressed against her chest. "I'm ready." The canopy slid back, and she climbed out of the cockpit to face her destiny. The air on the island was different, charged with possibility and heavy with the weight of history. The figures approaching wore expressions of respect and anticipation, as if they'd been waiting their entire lives for this moment. "Welcome home, Wraith," one of them said, using her call sign with obvious familiarity. "We've been expecting you." As Marisol stood on the stone runway, surrounded by people who represented something larger than any single nation or conflict, she felt the last piece of her old identity falling away. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a guardian, a bridge between worlds, a pilot tasked with missions that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The real war was just beginning. The figure who had welcomed her was a woman in her 60s, wearing a uniform that seemed to incorporate elements from multiple military traditions. Her bearing was unmistakably that of a senior officer, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences beyond conventional warfare. "I'm General Martinez," she said, extending her hand to Marisol. "I served with your grandfather during the original mission. We've been maintaining the network ever since, waiting for the right moment to complete what he started." The handshake was firm and warm, conveying both respect and relief. "You knew him?" Marisol asked. "I was his wingman on that final mission. I saw him go down, saw the Messerschmitts tear his aircraft apart. But I also saw something else, a flash of light that didn't belong to any weapon I knew. That's when I understood we were dealing with forces beyond conventional warfare." General Martinez gestured toward the ancient structures that dotted the island. "This place has been a haven for warriors across the centuries. Knights, pilots, soldiers who understood that some battles transcend the conflicts of their time. Your grandfather found his way here after his death, and he's been preparing for your arrival ever since." The revelation was overwhelming, but Marisol found herself accepting it with the same adaptability that had carried her through combat zones. The rules of reality had changed, and she was learning to navigate by new principles. "The payload," she said, touching the portfolio against her chest. "What's in it?" "Strategic intelligence about conflicts that are approaching faster than most people realize," General Martinez replied. "Your grandfather was carrying the first piece of a larger puzzle. Over the decades, we've been gathering additional information, building a comprehensive picture of the challenges ahead." They walked toward the main structure, an imposing building that seemed to blend architectural elements from different eras. Gothic arches stood alongside modern steel and glass, creating a visual representation of continuity across time. "The world is changing," General Martinez continued. "New powers are rising, old alliances are shifting, and the next great conflict is already beginning to unfold. Most governments are focused on immediate threats, but we're preparing for the war that's coming after the war that's coming." Inside the building, Marisol found herself in a command center that would have been impressive in any era. Advanced computer systems shared space with ancient maps, and personnel from various nations worked side by side on projects that seemed to span decades. "How many people are part of this?" she asked. "Fewer than you might think, more than you'd expect," General Martinez replied with a slight smile. "We recruit carefully, focusing on individuals who demonstrate exceptional capability and unshakable integrity. People like your grandfather, people like you." A young officer approached, carrying a tablet that displayed what looked like global threat assessments. "General, we're seeing increased activity in the Pacific sector. The patterns match the projections from the Vegas documents." General Martinez nodded grimly. "It's beginning. The dominoes are starting to fall exactly as predicted." She turned to Marisol. "This is why your grandfather's mission was so important. The intelligence he was carrying contained early warning indicators for the conflicts we're now facing." Marisol studied the displays around them, recognizing patterns that echoed her own experiences in Afghanistan and other theaters. "You're talking about a new kind of warfare, not just military conflict, but something that encompasses economic, technological, and cultural dimensions." "Exactly. Your grandfather understood that the victory in World War II was just the beginning. The real test would come decades later, when the values that conflict had defended would face new challenges from unexpected directions." The weight of responsibility was settling on Marisol's shoulders like a familiar burden. She'd thought her military career was over, ended by a helicopter crash that had damaged her depth perception and grounded her permanently. But now, she understood that everything she'd experienced had been preparation for this moment. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. General Martinez smiled, and Marisol caught a glimpse of the young pilot who had flown wing-to-wing with her grandfather 8 decades ago. "First, you need to understand the full scope of what we're facing. Then, you need to decide if you're ready to dedicate your life to a mission that may never end." "My grandfather did it," Marisol replied. "He gave his life for a mission he didn't fully understand, trusting that someone else would complete it. I can do at least as much." "That's what we hoped you'd say," General Martinez said. "But this isn't just about following your grandfather's example. This is about becoming something new, something that can operate in the gray areas between nations and conflicts, between the living and the dead." The implications were staggering. Marisol found herself thinking about the P-51 Mustang that had carried her here, about the ghostly figure in the nose art that seemed to exist in the space between worlds. She was being offered a chance to become something similar, a bridge between realities, a guardian who could operate beyond the normal constraints of time and space. "Show me," she said. General Martinez led her to a secure briefing room where the full scope of the organization's intelligence was laid out. Maps covered the walls, showing conflict zones and strategic positions across the globe. But these weren't just current threats. They were projections of future conflicts, detailed analyses of how today's tensions would evolve into tomorrow's wars. Your grandfather was carrying the first piece of this puzzle, General Martinez explained. Intelligence gathered by operatives who could see patterns that others missed. Over the decades, we've been adding to that foundation, building a comprehensive picture of the challenges ahead. Marisol studied the displays, her trained eye picking out the strategic implications. You're talking about a multi-generational conflict, not just one war, but a series of connected struggles that will span decades. Exactly. And each phase will require different approaches, different capabilities. Your grandfather's generation won the conventional war. Your father's generation handled the Cold War. Your generation has been fighting asymmetric conflicts in the Middle East. But the next phase,